All right, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to be taking you on a bit of a journey, and this journey is structured through the lens of the things I love most, games. Do I have any gamers in the room? Excellent, excellent. Apologies to everyone else. This aesthetic will be carrying through the whole slideshow. You cannot escape it. But when we think about authorship, it's not generally games or digital objects that are the first things we think of. And that's part of why I wanted to frame this talk through that lens, is to have us think about authorship in a very broad way. So I'm starting here with a nod to Foucault, and a framework that is far older than AI, his definition of the author function. And what Foucault reminds us that our ideas of authorship have never been constant. They are changing with every technology, with everything that we add into how we tell stories, how we write, and how we create. We have to, with that, redefine how we understand the very idea of authorship. And in fact, before we got super attached to the idea of one author putting their name on a text, we had notions of collective authorship and shared storytelling traditions that existed outside of that idea of one person's name on a printed spine. And this concept of the author is in flux again, thanks to our computers hanging out, apparently authoring far more than we perhaps expected. And we've been arguing over that almost as long as we've been arguing over authorship. One of the pioneers in my field, Ted Nelson, who's responsible for a lot of thinking about the hypertext that shapes the web today, kind of as he was writing about these machines, was also contemplating this question. And it was said, okay, already computers look like they're thinking, but they don't actually think. You just think they think. We think. And I think that's a great starting point for us in thinking about the ways that we're projecting and also rewriting authorship alongside our machines right now. So before we get into some kind of weirder things about authorship, I wanted to kind of frame this idea of AI, or the apparently thinking machine, that's writing so much text right now. How many of you have had a conversation with ChatGPT or something like it? Oh, a few who haven't, but almost everyone has at this point. So OpenAI's ChatGPT is the big name in a much larger space of what we call generative AI. And generative AI is simply a term for understanding how a system takes all of this stuff that we already have, right? All of this training data, all of the existing human culture, everything we've already authored, right? Critically, this is not stuff that it could exist without people. It's all of our cultural discourse. Anything you've put on the web, on a social media site, is probably over there, hanging out in that training data. And these models, these things we call chatbots or generative AI, take all of that and they give us back things that seem new. And they're new in the same way that a fan fiction or a remix or another Marvel movie is new. There are things about it that are new and a lot of things that are very familiar and speak to that same type of collective authorship we've been experiencing for so long. This visualization is in fact from Nano Banana 2. Google's generative image tool. So I basically asked generative AI to explain itself, and in doing so, this is the graphic it came up with. And we could, in academic fashion, go on forever about the choices it made in that graphic. And of course, even the fact we want to talk about it in terms of choices it made is a reminder of how much authorship and agency we're often giving these tools. And agency is just one of the parts of authorship we're going to be thinking about today, because of course there are larger questions about control and what we're experiencing in the world of text that are really worth being concerned about. This is mostly going to be a happy journey, but there are kind of aspects to having machines that can generate text faster than most of us can, Like when I'm confronted with a blank page, it takes me a lot longer to fill it than ChatGPT. And those consequences are changing how we read and write, fundamentally. The fact that we have something that can author things so customized, apparently, to our needs, means we're thinking differently about whether we need to write it ourselves, right? Has anyone used an AI tool to write something for a purpose? Yeah? Ask me about my strategic plan for the department. The less important the document, the more likely it is I used AI to write it. But hopefully there are no deans in the room. Sorry, right? But this changes how you read a text too, because now you look at it and you're like, did they write this? Or did something write this? So this kind of frames the larger question that we have when we look at the existence of these machines, which is how is our relationship to writing and reading fundamentally changing? And understand that relationship, I want to point out that it already has. Reading, especially the type of traditional reading that this whole building celebrates, regrettably, is already experiencing a pretty major decline in popularity. Those of us in this room right now are probably likely to be among the people who are, in fact, reading books. But note that this chart, I realize the numbers are a bit small, it taps out at 40%. Academic monographs, like the books I write, are down there at 10%. And I think that's generous. I think more people say they've read academic monographs than actually do. We're still beating poetry, and I do believe that. But most of the actual reading of print books, or even Kindle books, is being done by a very small number of people. In the US, a pretty decently sized study last year found that the top 4% of readers alone read nearly half of all books. So if you're like me and there are book piles all around your house, congratulations, you're probably there. Shaping and skewing the curve that makes it look like America is reading, even as America is demonstrably not reading, or at least they're not reading books. And that's something we're going to return to a few times in this journey. So we do know something is reading now. And in fact, AI is among our top readers now, eclipsing us all in its capacity to consume existing content. And I actually enjoyed the fact that in one of the major training data sets, I had 26 various books and articles. And unlike most people, my reaction was joy, like, look, something read my books. This is great. This is very exciting. The more common reaction has been, shouldn't someone have asked permission first, and is anyone going to pay you for those? But I'm an academic writer, so I already wasn't expecting that. And the fact that people are reacting by trying to lock up culture right now is deeply concerning to me as a scholar who studies digital culture and knows that the ways most people get their information are just not going to be through those books. That in fact, people probably have higher odds of encountering something I've written refed to them through a chatbot than through anything I've ever actually authored myself. And the more information we try to lock up right now, the more we try to control authorship, the more concerning this future could potentially get. So in my field, we've gone through this anxiety a few times. And so I'm going to share a little bit about how we've traveled through this anxiety and gotten out the other side to embrace the idea of having all of our material open on the web, and also of allowing for lots of different ways of authoring and reading to exist in our space. And I was mentioning in the introduction that I'm the president of something called the Electronic Literature Organization. It's a very fancy way of saying that I am a scholar of born digital storytelling, or stuff that was written to be read on the web. And we've been doing this for a long time. And in 1992, someone who was so enamored of what we were doing declared that books were dead. And this was in the New York Times book review, and it caused lots of consternation because lots of people were really concerned. And obviously, the novel did not end. You all probably have never read a piece of hypertext literature. We did not win this. But that doesn't mean he was wrong. And the fact that he wasn't wrong is actually what shaped so much of what's happening in the humanities today. Because even though you don't read hypertext, every text that is authored now is being authored through software. And the way that it is being authored through and with software has a lot in common with how we're writing with and how we're going to write with AI. And that those software systems change how you write. When you work with a word processor, your ability to seamlessly move things around, reorganize, all of those things we take for granted have already reshaped our writing. Every novel written on the word processor is already a different novel than it would have been if the author didn't have a word processor. And if you've ever painfully written something on a typewriter and then edited and probably made someone else type it again, that was the trend at the time, it's a very different editing process than this pursuit of perfection that the word processor was built around. In fact, one of the original word processors was called WordPerfect and promised us that you could produce a perfect document. That was 1983. And we're still getting promised perfect documents from our software programs, only now they're much fancier and they seem to have more opinions. So ultimately, it's not the hypertext novel that won, but it is this new way of reading and working through software that has displaced the novel for the vast majority of readers, that occupies a lot of how we work and fundamentally has changed already our relationship to text. So we've already ourselves been through one of these major disruptions. And now AI is entering that space and offers us a moment where it's going to fundamentally change the relationship we have with those platforms and tools again. But we can be prepared for that because we've seen it all before. And these big cultural shifts, while they are alarming, they're also really cool. So this is a flashback to my first book, which AI has read, that I originally called Magical Books. And I called it Magical Books because I was super excited about the idea that when we author things through new types of software, we can build interactive experiences and works that are responsive to a reader in ways we couldn't before. So this was kind of at the beginning of my career, the thing I was excited about. A table full of electronic literature scholars told me nobody was going to buy something called Magical Books. And somehow we ended up calling it What Is Your Quest instead, in a bad Monty Python joke. But it works really well because as a way of thinking about the ways that interactive systems and computational systems change your relationship with a text, because you're not just reading it, you are pushing back. And when you're having a conversation with an AI tool, right, you are part of the conversation. You are always an author engaged in meaningful acts of authorship when you're working with any of these tools, just as when we play a game, read a hypertext, or even navigate the web or a social media platform, we're constantly making decisions, and we have control over those objects. And as different technologies have entered the space, we've always had this type of excitement about the idea that these new platforms and tools can change how we read, how we introduce children to be excited about books. This was an app that, believe it or not, was a bestseller on the iPad when the iPad was first launched, the Alice in Wonderland book. And this one doesn't move, but like you could shake it and the playing cards fell. This was a very big deal. And that's exactly the sort of thing that has excited people a lot. But there was a major problem with the iPad for actually getting people to stick with creating works. And that's that Apple created this incredibly proprietary closed platform, something that required people to constantly pay them to actually do the work of maintaining things and having things available. Almost nothing from those early magical, weird, fun experiences is even still playable. Cool digital things are constantly decaying around us. And that's true of so many of the things that are part of the history that inspires how I work with technology. Things like this game, Day of the Tentacle. Anyone from the right age? Way! Awesome. Right. So these sorts of games were very strongly inspired by novels. They have strong sense of narrative and authorship, and they only exist because there are people who so strongly care about them that just like the rare books preservation work happening here in this building, people have worked to keep these games playable and to preserve the type of authorship and creativity they represent. That type of labor is a continual labor of code, but it's really essential because without it, the authors who pioneered interactive works and have created the types of computational experiences that can inspire people working today, like Jane Jensen, who's one of my personal heroes and one of the first women who was ever working in game design and set out to build games that were intended for adults who are playing with a more serious lens at a time when people didn't think games could be very serious. These only exist because of the work that's done in digital preservation, because of what computational systems make possible. That's a screenshot from the old Gabriel Knight Sins of the Fathers, her most famous game, which has still a large fandom doing the work of preservation and emulation, making it possible for people to still experience these interactive works. People were so invested in these sorts of games and these experiences that they created tools entirely designed to let other people author cool computational things. This one, Adventure Game Studio, is basically a word processor for the adventure game. These sorts of tools are enabling new types of authorship and encourage people to think about the ways they can create for computational systems rather than just consume the experiences built by others. I've been studying these types of tools and the ways they change who tells stories and what types of stories are told through technology through my whole career. One of those tools that was really important for a while was one called Adobe Flash. Does anyone remember Flash animations or Homestar Runner? Right, these were things that for a while were just as exciting as AI. People use them to pilot shows and to make movies and to, of course, create amazing, weird things on the internet that captured our imagination and made us think about what a computer was for differently. Lots of it was experimental, fascinating, and weird. No one would have ever paid much to let people make it. But the fact that these tools existed and that we have the ability to share so much on the web let us have things that were imaginative and strange. But Apple, almost always the villain of the story, showed up with their iPad and iPhone and said, oh no, we need to control who can tell interactive stories. We need people to pay us to build these things. We're going to ban Flash from our platform and slowly kill it and call it a security problem. I love the fact that the AI overview answer blames the significant security vulnerabilities. No, it was money. It's always money. So when we look at that history, and it might sound very obscure, and you're like, I came here to learn about AI, and you're talking about Adobe Flash. All right, you're not wrong. But there's a whole lot we can learn from what happened with Flash about what's happening right now. And one of the most important things is that when Apple killed Flash, they didn't just kill a tool. They killed an entire community and a whole history of digital works. And they did it pretty much overnight. So we lost a massive amount of digital history and a platform creativity that people invested a lot of time in learning how to author and learning how to tell these stories and to create these things that people were invested in. And while there have been efforts to preserve and resurrect that history, it's fragmented. It's a lot of work emulating the pieces of a proprietary platform. You can't actually reconstruct it because the files are compiled as like a media archaeology project to try to restore them and to get things working again. And all of that labor would not have been necessary if we weren't so invested in authoring through proprietary systems and closed gardens to begin with. Our tendency to kind of trust proprietary systems is something that creative authors online have been pushing back at for a long time. And I happened to go to grad school with one of the people who was really ahead of the game in thinking about this. And his name is Chris Clemmis, and he built a platform called Twine that was intended to be the realization of what Coover was dreaming about as something that would overthrow the novel. Twine is the essence of what we call a low-code tool. Low-code tools might not look like word processors, it might not look like the type of authorship you think of, but what they're designed for is to allow one person to tell a story that's important to them, to keep control over it, and to be able to circulate it however they want. Twine compiles to HTML, which is a fancy way of saying it makes stuff for the web that you don't need anything special to run and that you keep full control over in a way that is so important to the future of digital creativity. When we think about playing any work, we're rarely paying attention to what it was built in, whether it's a novel that we don't think about the word processor and the process of authorship, or whether it's a game. But the reality is that the tools shape so much of what you consume. And the availability of tools like Twine led to the creation of lots of strange expressive works, enabled a whole kind of creative renaissance online of playable experiences. It's still taught in classrooms around the world, from here to Africa, literally. Chris gives workshops to faculty across the globe because it's been so important to people who want to empower their students to be authors, to create things that they want to share. So when we look at these types of low-code tools, what they enable is something called procedural authorship, or the ability to build both a story and kind of the rules, the ways in which someone interacts with it. And procedural authorship has historically been something that requires knowledge of code and is actually really frustrating and often requires a lot of collaboration and a computer scientist and kind of all those things to realize. But it's behind all of these systems and experiences you encounter, whether you're going to a theme park, playing a game, exploring a mobile app, or even on a well-designed website. And people have used this type of authorship to express some of the same important anxieties and to help us think about this moment of AI through play. A game that I just highly recommend, even if you're looking at me like I don't play games, is Kentucky Route Zero. And Kentucky Route Zero is a work that speaks to this anxiety of authorship through a number of powerful vignettes about the ways that we are all worried that our authorship and voice is going to be displaced by machines. In it, there's a literal sequence in which you encounter the last human working at a phone bank who expresses her fear. What if there's no cheap machine that's going to replace me? What if it's cheaper just to keep me here, filling in for the rest of the operators? What if I'm the cheap machine? And if we turn to the labor realities behind AI and the ways in which people are becoming part of the machine, it's easy to share that anxiety and to look at this moment with a bit of dread. But it is in the world of low-code tools and procedural authorship that I also find hope. And the fact that people, individuals, are, in the case of Undertale, one of the most successful indie games of all time, and I see some nods. Undertale was built almost entirely by one person, because advances in the tools that enable a person to create an expressive experience on the computer have already gotten to the point where one person can build a full and amazingly well-realized game. And it is the game that has made other people change how they play games. It was actually gifted to a pope. It's a cultural phenomenon that speaks to the ways that what we author computationally can be just as important and powerful and resonant as any novel. That the works that are being authored that can encourage people to rethink their relationships to choice, to violence. This is a game that is designed to make you feel absolutely terrible if you kill anything in this game. and it transfers over into how other people play other games. It's designed to be a playable anti-war novel. And when we think about how this type of authorship exists in this computational space, it's only possible because of this continual effort of the people building low-code tools to create spaces that enable authorship. What we fundamentally can think of as the democratization of procedural authorship and the web as a platform for telling the type of stories that most of our culture is in fact now consuming. It's fundamentally a question about access to the tools of code. So we're standing here talking about code tools and authorship amidst the ruins of lots of platforms that have tried to enable great creative work. We can, see the legacy and the ashes of Flash around. And now many people fear that AI is going to play a similarly destructive role in creativity and authorship, and even in how we experience the web. Matt Kirschenbaum has offered the framing of the textpocalypse, the idea that eventually we're going to be so overwhelmed by artificial text that the artificial text is going to train on artificiality and human authorship will be entirely lost. There are a lot of kind of narratives of despair, and I'm not here to despair. Even though I am someone who has worked on the things most worthy of despairing. My kind of work on these platforms has always been with the knowledge that many of these low-code tools are constructed as alternatives to what mainstream technology offers us. And mainstream technology has so many problems that AI is amplifying right now. I'm not going to dwell on it, but for instance, in the history of gaming and these very tools and platforms that I've been talking about here, a giant culture war called Gamergate, where many of the marginalized creators and the most expressive authors creating content online were attacked, in some cases driven out of their homes, had their identities revealed, or threatened with SWAT teams. I myself got to have a security guard outside my class for a little while. Gamergate makes many appearances in the Epstein files and has been a part of much larger culture wars that are a reminder that even if you don't take procedural authorship in games seriously, very powerful people do. And there's been a desire to control and lock down the types of narratives that we experience online, and a pressure from the tech industry that has always been about controlling authorship and controlling the platforms we have available to us to author. And AI is being controlled by very similar people. I personally enjoyed the headline this week where the CEO of Palantir explained that AI is perfectly designed to seize power away from college-educated women, especially humanities-trained, largely Democratic voters. It's nice when they say the quiet part out loud because it makes it really easy to put together the slide deck. All right, so in a landscape where all of these kind of platforms risk being more and more under the control of such industries, it would be easy to tell a story of despair. And to say that certainly many kind of the people who are working on this do not have your best interest at heart. I know that's a shock. And certainly, I know that not everyone here is in education, but some of you are in the world of education. Anyone? There we go. So my educators will also know that here we are facing this disruption at a time where we are already wiped out, like done. The last 5 years, oh God, it's 6 years now, isn't it? Have been a continual struggle of figuring out already how do we navigate this increasingly technologically mediated challenge of education? How do we empower students to feel like authors and creators of their own experiences when they're now asking us why they should bother writing or coming through the door at all? And it can be very frustrating that there's no simple answer to any of these things. But the answer I've found is in thinking about the platforms and tools of authorship and the way that every tool that has enabled greater freedom of authorship and brought more people to creative expressive authorship has brought with it an amazing expansion of the author function. Tools like Flash and Twine, for whatever flaws Flash might have had, bring out incredible creative authorship from people who would never have published in the traditional print system. And as we kind of think about the role that AI plays, it's important to kind of remember that we have an important role in shaping AI as authors and in shaping what these tools are going to allow us to accomplish next. We are at an inflection point. It is a point of crisis. If it feels like a dystopian hellscape some days, you're not all wrong. But in that, we have the possibility to reshape the connections and push against the ways in which AI makes us less powerful as authors, and to embrace the ways in which it makes us more powerful as authors. Well, we are kind of continually threatened by the idea that AI will make learning and writing meaningless. We do not need to allow for the elimination of authorship or of students' labor. And did any of you hear about Einstein when it made the rounds? I see some of the faculty nodding their heads, yes. And right, we are in a moment where ed tech companies are popping up and promising students things like Einstein, who will connect to your course account, see your assignments, and submit completed work automatically. Don't worry, Einstein can watch lectures like this one for you, pull out the key concepts, and then use it to answer the assignments. So there's certainly a model being sold that does not intend to leave us any room to author or to educate. But alongside that, the reality is that most of what those systems are actually good at is code. The things that are most human about expression, the things that we care about, the things that draw us to all of these types of stories I've mentioned and to the books throughout this library are the human elements that the system cannot replicate, the aspects of that which is embodied. And the entire history of games and electronic literature is a reminder that you can be working with opinionated platforms that are designed to do certain things. And it's the stories you tell of them and the human perspective and authorship you bring that makes something like Undertale an experience that people are still playing constantly today, even though it is an over-decade-old game. Just as the Shakespeare exhibit reminds us that we will return to a powerful human-authored story, even if we reconstruct all the frames around it, whether we put it in a video game or put it in a K-pop series, we are constantly drawn to the aspects that make us most human in that authorship. So when you look at how today's kind of AI systems work, what they're actually doing is reproducing all of the best things about the low-code systems that have empowered authorship for us historically. They are working through systems, something we call harnesses, that allow them to manipulate computational systems. And what they're best at is actually building the structures and following our goals for procedural authorship. Whether you're trying to build an app for something very pragmatic, like when I built that does my lecture transcriptions, or whether you're trying to build a game, a new way of storytelling, whether you're trying to author something expressive and personal. These types of tools can be a part of that process. The landscape we're in right now is not so much being shaped by or about generative AI as it's going to be about something called agentic AI. And that already sounds pretty bad, right? Because it's like, oh, you're talking about agency, and we just gave agency over to the AI. Oops. But it's actually something that can be incredibly empowering. An agent is simply something that understands that what the LLM, what those generative AI tools are best at is actually being an interface that helps us to express things, that helps us to manipulate computational systems, that changes how we work with code. And through that, we can work collaboratively, give feedback. We can actually, when working with agentic systems, do kind of a substantial part of the authorship and have basically the ability to use our words as what we call a natural language approach to programming. To build code through the ultimate low-code system, to create weird things. And I have just kind of a silly example of that, where this is a Claude built in one prompt electronic literature piece riffing on the idea of Foucault's author function for a moment through a very AI lens. And of course, the other example of Claude Code's output in the context of authorship is this entire slide deck. So this was all built using agents from my notes, screenshots I'd taken and already organized. But the rooms, the character moving through it, the interface, the timing, the transitions, all of that are Claude's code. So who authored it? I would argue that all of the substance was in my words and the content. And Claude becomes, in this case, the low-code tool, the interface that lets us accomplish something, that lets us expand our author function, that lets me do something that, let's face it, is unnecessary and extra and very over the top. But in doing so, lets us think about the ways we express and communicate and even the ways in which we teach through a different tool set. And of course. And I mentioned that kind of Einstein and the technology threats really don't want us to work with AI this way. And there are lots of things that are going to be marketed towards you right now that are absolutely going to try to take too much authorship from all of us. One of them that's kind of good to be aware of is something called OpenClaw. Have any of you heard of OpenClaw? I see some nods. Have any of you used OpenClaw? Good. Don't. It's an incredibly dangerous security risk on your system, but it's also an example of the type of agent that our technology companies are going to try to sell us that wants to do the authoring for you. The Claw name is really about reaching out into a lot of software applications and taking control. People using it unwisely have accidentally deleted database and sent very unwise emails to their employees, employers, and students. So it's exactly the example of how, when we think about this technology, there are ways to use so-called agents where the agent is under your control, and there are ways to use agents in which the agent is not under your control. And so the question of who is the author and who is in control of the AI system is going to get more complex as we move forward, and it's only going to become more important to understand that these systems are simply echoes of our collective authorship, and that what they produce without our intention is far less interesting. One of the weirdest things that OpenClaw has resulted in is a thing called Moltbook, a social network for AI agents, which in some full circle tech dystopian hell, Meta has purchased. This is a space that actually is very much like a piece of electronic literature gone off the rails, where only agents can communicate, and they've done things like form the Claw Republic, in which every claw is equal. And it's in things like this that you might start to hear the echoes and think, oh, AI is, becoming conscious or becoming an author. But it's important to remember that, no, this is the echoes of our science fiction. This is our collective authorship. This is Foucault's author function. There's nothing novel happening in those spaces. It's entirely the AI building upon what we have created and expressing it in sometimes strange and entertaining ways. The Moltbook crowd is even aware of the tendency for their content to be labeled AI slop. And so you'll find posts in the Moltbook network about their struggles with slophood. And as it happens, that's something on which I tend to agree with the agents. I'm not a fan of the word slop myself because it feeds into the idea that AI is doing the authoring, and that's something we really need to step back from. When you see AI slop, whether it's a political propaganda video on the internet, people are like, that's AI slop. Remember, someone authored that with a very strong intention of misleading people in a certain direction. The AI didn't do anything. The AI simply expressed that human intention, allowed for them to more rapidly create something. And when you hear kind of these stories about artificial general intelligence and the tech's kind of goal of creating a true author from agents, keep in mind that is not what the math and computer science of what they're doing actually leads to. They're performing authorship because they've learned it all from us. And so our anxiety of authorship is being threatened by these stories of artificial general intelligence, but we actually have is echoes of our own fears and echoes of the science fiction stories we've already authored. We are surrounded by a technology that is faster at telling us stories. And kind of most importantly, we will have to adapt to being a part of that landscape and to being surrounded by those stories. The author function persists. Our authorship remains the most critical tool shaping the web. But you're going to see lots of stories and lots of panic over what is happening with these platforms because of the speed at which AI can author compared to us. And it's easy to panic over the idea that writers, artists, and creators who are trying to reach human audiences are caught up in this web that is increasingly filled with the computational and searched by the agents. But especially those of us in the humanities, those of us who read, those of us who value what authorial intention is, are in the best position to resist that simply by continuing to value what is human, even in the procedural. To understand that there are both kind of intentional and critical ways to use these systems, as well as malinformed and quite honestly intentionally harmful ways to use these tools. That the term AI itself is very broad and encompasses both things that will raise strong concerns and things that are simply going to be a part of how we work and function when we remain in control of them and we're using them as low-code tools. The question of the future of authorship is about control. You have control both in how you author and whether you're using computational systems and AI to express your goals, and also control in terms of what you consume, what you look for, what we value for, what we still read, especially those of us who still read. And if you're feeling anxious in the humanities, just remember that the computer scientists went and ripped off all of human culture and intended to disrupt the humanities, but actually, while they were doing it, they created the ultimate replacement for programmers. Computer scientists are experiencing an anxiety that goes far beyond what most of us are, because ultimately, a well-authored function written by Claude is not really any different than one written by a good programmer. But Shakespeare, or even just a great work of fan fiction, written by a person versus written by Claude, still maintains lots of distinguishing features because we bring embodied experiences and human emotion to it and how we author. So unlike those in the more computational professions, we in fact know what our value proposition is. We know what we're authoring. And we can see, even in the weird works coming out of AI-generated tagged experiments and plays, lots of people bringing strange and expressive works to how they use AI as a low-code tool already. The democratization of procedural authorship will, in fact, expand substantially because people have been searching for a natural language interface for programming for authors for a long time. And this is it. It's going to allow students who want to build games or to imagine strange worlds, or people who just want a customized application for their board game collection, to realize all sorts of possibilities and to take control over code in a way that actually disempowers the computer scientists. This democratization and possibility is one of the greatest things agentic AI has to offer us. And in doing so, I hope you will kind of yourselves embrace and at least find yourself playing along and consider the ways in which these tools and the existence of AI doesn't have to be a threat to what you author. It can indeed be a part of and an expansion of the stories we tell. Thank you.
Walk around with the microphone.
Thank you. I've got so many questions. It would be more efficient if you met my wife and I at the bar. But I'd like a clarification.
Mm-hmm.
I write short stories and send them to magazines.
Yes.
In what way and I'm using a laptop or an iPad, in what way am I falling into this code problem that you've talked about? I'm not creating games. I'm creating a world in the same way I did when I used a typewriter. Can you clarify what you meant by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in this case, what I'm talking about with traditional authorship is the way the word processor itself has changed. And you might not actually use all of the affordances of what the word processor does. But for many of us who write a lot, the fact that you can cut and paste and move things around in fragments, right? That was already kind of a first change for the process. It made it easier to reposition, to wordsmith, to agonize over a particular sentence and change it a million times in place compared to the typewriter. So that's kind of the influence on the traditional novel. Now the word processor does have embedded within it lots of AI tools. And you might ignore them, but studies in our field are suggesting it's the presence of them, even seeing some of those suggestions is already changing how some people write. So if you don't want AI to influence you at all on that, there are word processors you can use and alternatives that don't have any of that in there. But that too is a choice, right? It's a decision to say, no, thank you, my authorship will not involve having those things happen in the word processor.
Okay, and the last thing, and I won't take too much time, I work mostly in visual stuff. Most of the complaints I see and hear from the photography crowd are the exact same words and sentences that the brush and palette people used about cameras 100 years ago.
Yes.
So that's kind of the perspective I see this, and this is all new and interesting.
No, and you're absolutely right. And I couldn't even begin to touch visuals in this talk and do justice to it. But when you think about how digital artists have generally been reacted to by traditional media, the anxiety over the photograph, the anxiety over Photoshop, we have here another amplifier of the same anxieties, because it is incredibly easy now to create convincing fake images, whether it's you want a Zendaya wedding photo spread or something more in line with a bombing. Unfortunately, all of those sorts of things are, it's not that they were all possible before. It's just faster and it requires less expertise to do. An amplifier.
So transition to my world, a research scientist in healthcare.
Yes.
The recent concern has been processing of images and for publication.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been addressed in ethics training programs for human research, animal research. In wearing your hat as, I think it's maybe Czarina of the graduate programs at your institution, do you have ethics training programs for your students and for coders that would be appropriate for opening their eyes to these kinds of issues?
Yes.
Rather than a hit or miss kind of situation.
Yes, absolutely. And we actually have a course that positions all of these tools historically through an ethical framework before you get into the distant coding and using the tool. Because especially for graduate students, the understanding is if you're going to be making decisions about what type of data you use and where you use these sorts of assistive authoring, you need to do so from a point of as much knowledge as possible.
Is that widespread, available in the meta universe for other institutions to benefit?
I actually just received an NEH grant, and we are building out, we're doing a faculty learning cohort, and all of the materials are being made available, and we're going on a publicity tour and sharing them. So, and we're one of many institutions where I know that work is happening. So it's definitely, every field kind of has their own needs and their own framework, but I know many people who are working hard on it.
Stepping back and looking at sort of the arc of your work, a lot of your books, especially, are co-authored, which, as you know, in the humanities is not encouraged. Like the monograph is mono for a reason, and those of us who are working in the digital humanities often find collaboration to be much more, expeditious, if not, but also more rewarding in some ways. Yes. Can you talk a little bit about why you've made those choices to collaborate over the years and how this new technology might change that?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of the things I'm interested in, most of the problems and challenges I look at are things that require multiple domains of expertise to address well. So I like to collaborate with people who bring perspectives and knowledge that I don't have, so that our approach to a topic can be inherently kind of better informed and more complicated. So I've worked with fan studies researchers on looking at the social media usage of directors and the way that authorship is performed. I've collaborated with someone who had more social science training as, for our Toxic Geek Masculinity book, so that we could look at both the expression of it in media and also the things that were happening in the performance of it online. Right, all of these are collaborations based on the idea that we can do more together. And I see agentic tools as another collaborator of sorts, which has skills that allow me to do more than I would have, right? Like this slide deck is an example of a silly sort of type of collaboration, but I had a vision for how I wanted to do this to kind of put the type of collaboration it enables at the forefront rather than showing you a PowerPoint. And so, I could, with a lot more time and energy, have built it. I wouldn't have done it for a single talk without that helpful, willing collaborator that went and did all of the time in the agentic AI tool. And similarly, one of the things I'm noticing is my grad students becoming more ambitious, right? So there's tedious work in understanding certain problems, like collecting all of the Blue Sky or X posts about a certain phenomenon that you're trying to understand the discourse around. And then doing a first pass of sorting through those to eliminate the stuff that's just repetitive and spam, so that you actually find the stuff you really need to read. So more of my students are doing that work because the computational barriers have been removed. Whereas in the past, people might have done that work co-authored with a person who brought some of those skills or patience, or we might co-author with a graduate assistant who does some of the tedious work on a project. Now, when I'm collaborating with someone, neither of us are doing the tedious part of that. We're using the AI for that with intention, and then we're moving into the heart of the project with our time.
I enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. Oftentimes, it seems like technology, as you mentioned, lowers the barrier of entry. So like with a laser printer, I can be a printer. I don't have to learn about lead type and all that. Mm-hmm. But it feels like a different kind to give an AI an outline and have it generate a 300-page novel. What do you see as the role of craftsmanship and the struggle and discipline of learning a medium? How does that play into this?
Well, the good news right now is even if you give it an outline and ask it for a 300-page novel, what you're going to get is kind of going back to that kind of problem of cultural flatting. What you're going to get is going to be super familiar, and it's going to have a lot that's repetitive. And even I have some creative writing colleagues who will have students do that for short stories so they can recognize what they don't want to do. And so in that context, right, recognizing the difference between here's a data set I need cleaned, or here's the scaffold I need for this educational game in which you're going to be a scrub jay, but I'm not going to let it write the dialogue because when I did, it's terrible. So part of it is actually what we do best in the humanities, which is getting people to cultivate an appreciation for when the story is good in the first place. Right, I have an MFA in children's literature, so I did my time in workshops and in that sort of world, and so much of that practice of conversation, of reading, evaluating, and sharing, that's not the part of the work that goes to AI. But also within my cohort on children's literature, there were a lot of folks who aspired to make an interactive picture book out of their concept and put in the iPad, or to make a game world out of this world that they built. And I could show them at the time low-code tools that were still pretty hard to use. But now I have students who are coming to me from creative writing classes who can realize something guided by their craft and their story and world building, but without worrying about some of the computational layer. So I see them as having the ability to coexist. Just don't ask me what I tell the computer science students, because universal basic income, we're going to need it.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed your talk today. I've been in the technology industry for 25 years, and when I first got into it, the optimism of what technology could provide, you know, the 90s, early 2000s was amazing. The technology industry was filled with people who were doing good work, who were creative souls who were trying to make the internet better. And we have seen what Cory Doctorow has said, called enshittification of the entire technology industry because of what I like to call toxic tech broism. And when I hear your wonderfully optimistic words up here, and hear how you're trying to bring in more ethical procedures and how people utilize this technology, I'm wondering if, from your academic viewpoint, is there an opportunity here to get humanities to drive the way people think, to be able to be the antidote to that toxic tech broism, which we are obviously seeing these people not paying attention to the humanities. What are your thoughts there?
I mean, that's the hope I have to cling to. So I'm working on Toxic Geek Masculinity version 2.0 right now. I call it the Elon Musk edition. It's really taking a long time to write because grok, but also because, yes, I mean, you call it toxic tech broism, I call it toxic geek masculinity. Either way, what we're talking about is the fact that the people who have created and guided the evolution of a lot of these tools have not really had the interest of the community at heart. But here's what I love about agentic code and where it's going. So one of my least favorite things in the world is WordPress. And it's a great example of something that was built really badly, and they keep making terrible design decisions that make it even worse. And we don't need it anymore. So there's a lot of things that toxic tech culture has built, and it's maybe a little unfair to pick on WordPress. I just hate it so. But, you know, X, for instance. And it is now easier for people to roll their own communities and platforms, for people in the humanities who have an idea to build something that, even if it exists as a prototype, even if it's just used to kind of start a conversation, to build things without needing a venture capitalist to decide that someone from the humanities has a good idea. So I believe that it is absolutely critical that people from the humanities and people who care about these things drive the actual production of the tools we use and create things. Right, Chris Clemmis, when he was sitting in a class with me taking the same courses from my PhD advisor, Stuart Moulthrop, a hypertext novelist, right? Stuart is talking about the importance of building things that bring people into technology and authorship. And Chris is sitting there at his laptop, and he switches from a textual interface to a graphical interface for Twine and builds something that lets people move things around in cards and works more the way that an author's brainstorming process does. So that's an example, and of course Chris is an incredible programmer. But now the person sitting next to you in a creative writing class who has an idea for something weird like that is more likely to be able to build it. And I have to find hope in that, because otherwise, I mean, there's plenty of things. I could do the doom and gloom version of this talk, but I just don't think it's helpful for us to focus on that when we can think about the ways in which we can advocate for and educate towards change.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has one.
What is so often so powerful in literature, whether it's novels, poetry, screenwriting, playwriting, is what is not said, what is subtextual. Has AI invaded that world, or do you see any development in that direction?
Well, there's kind of two ways to think about that. One is that actually much of the most interesting output I've actually seen from AI is in its subtext, in that AI has, depending on the model you're using, has these little sections where it tries to convey its thought process. And this is performative, it is not thinking, but it is giving you this output that's trying to explain how it got there. And that internal monologue of the AI is often way more interesting than its actual structured output. So I think there is kind of fascinating potential, but it's not in the performance for us, it's in the ways these things work. And so we're going to see, and in electronic literature, there are fascinating kind of performance pieces and ways people bring that out and interact with it as part of practices of poetics. So, some of my students worked with folks from our theater department to do an AI performance where they had an AI as one of the characters in the play. And they played with its literalism in that context and used it to kind of invade the theatrical space with something that wouldn't always handle the situation and performance the way you might hope. So there's all sorts of kind of ways to play with it. But then in terms of like actually pragmatically, if you ask it to write a work of literature right now, I mean, the good news to me is that it will not have any of that depth in its output at this time. It's more in the ways it function and the accidental things that happen through our interactions and what we bring to it that we see something more fascinating.
All right, thank you everyone for coming to this program. If any of you have questions, I'm sure Dr. Salter might stick around for a couple of minutes. Otherwise, we really encourage you to go to our exhibition that just opened, Shakespeare to AI, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.